Hey everyone, I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's case study. I've been looking forward to this one for a while. I have had some really cool conversations with Angela Brown from Niche. She's with us here today. We're going to talk about competition, right? And the market and how it's evolving and some things that independent schools should be thinking about. But before we get to that, Angela, welcome to this case study. Thank you.
Of course. Thanks for having me. I'm excited too.
My guess is a lot of people who are watching this are familiar with you or have met you. You come from independent schools, but for
Yeah,
those who aren't, can you spend a little bit of time introducing yourself and niche?
of course.
Great.
I'm Angela, as Peter mentioned, and I oversee a department that does content strategy development, research over at Niche. Niche is if you aren't familiar with us, the country's leading college and school search platform. And that is why we have lots of really great data that we're also going to talk about in this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, immense amount of data. And one of the things I want to talk about out of the gate was, you know, how are families approaching search now? I mean, is it just that they're looking at independent schools, or are they thinking also about other options in terms of maybe public schools in their market, charter schools? 'Cause it just strikes me that competition isn't, independent school A competing with independent school B. It's just a much more complicated landscape than it was because there's far more choices available. What are you seeing at the niche level around that?
You are absolutely correct. And I love this question because, excuse me, what parents are looking for when you look at different types of schools that they consider and ultimately choose isn't different. But because of what we've seen with, post-COVID, if we can say post-COVID, families have really sort of had this awakening that there are all of these different choices available to them. And I've seen that a lot of schools in different categories, independent schools, Catholic schools, boarding schools, there's a lot of focus on schools of your same type. But I think the smarter approach is to really think about competition more broadly. And I know that that's what we'll spend, the next
Yeah.
30 minutes or so getting into. But families are really looking at it all. There's a chart that I really love, and maybe we can include this in the notes from our
Yeah.
parent survey last year that looks at the gap between consideration and choice. And so we look at different school types, and you see X percentage of families considered this type of school, but here's what they chose. And in most cases, there's a pretty big gap there. And what that tells me is that families, in a lot of cases, everything is on the table. Everybody wants to make sure that their child or children are in an environment where their needs are being met, whatever those needs look like. But they're willing to consider whatever options possible, with few exceptions, before they make a final decision. So if you're working in an independent school and you're only focused on the other independent schools in your backyard, I would really encourage you to widen that focus. Look at the public schools, look at the charter schools if you have them. I'm in a state that doesn't, but
Yeah.
many states do.
Yeah.
Online schooling is definitely a factor. Homeschooling is definitely a factor. There are still people who are doing these sort of micro school pods. So there are just so many different options. Honestly, affordability is a big issue too. And as we know, independent schools are probably the least affordable on that list. And
Yep.
so that's a really big factor as well. But I do think that if you're thinking strategically about enrollment management, you have to be looking at competition holistically.
So let's just focus on independent schools for a second, then we'll broaden. I mean, if a family was going to choose a independent school over any of those options that you just stated to me before, in your mind, based on what you're seeing through the families that are funneling through, what is separating independent schools from the free options per se? What are you seeing there in terms of the differentiators?
I, you know, I will start with what I think is truly unique to independent schools, because I do think that there can be this common assumption that independent schools are inherently superior to other options. And that's something to be very careful about, because, as we've mentioned, there are not only a lot of other options available, but there can be some similarities when you do that competitive analysis. So it's really important to understand what those distinguishing factors are. Where I think independent schools really shine is in their ability to adapt to changes that are happening in the market and in the industry. That is something that can be really challenging for public schools or even charter schools that are part of large networks, online schools that might have fewer resources. And that's something that we saw with COVID, right? Independent schools were able to pivot quickly and adapt to this very complex, very challenging situation in ways that other schools couldn't. And that's still true. Independent schools are very nimble, and there's a lot of opportunity there. Independent schools also have a tendency, even though this doesn't tend to be as important when we survey families, but independent schools do have very, very good facilities. And so that's something that, you might be able to highlight. In some cases, there are some other school types that have really great facilities, but those tend to be the two areas where I think independent schools really shine, with that flexibility and adaptability being the most important.
When you say, facility, I love how you bring up facilities, because every market is different, but there's but I just can never, it's so funny. My kids used to do this program here in the greater Seattle area. It was over on the east side of town, if you're familiar, and it was at a high school there. And you would pull up to this high school, and it was a public high school, and this LEED certified building, turf fields in the back. At that moment, they were building a whole new gym, athletic facility that you knew was going to be exceptional. So like in that case, it was kind of a wash, right? Facility,
Absolutely.
It was a wash. So with that in mind, like what are you seeing generationally? Because you do a lot of work when you start to research, like how do millennials differ from Gen X, from baby boomers and whatnot. And, whenever I talk about this, I always feel like I have to like put a big asterisk out there, because it's really hard to like lump everybody together and expect everybody's going to have the same behaviors. I know that's not the case, but there are reasons why these behaviors are associated, because there is some relevancy. But, on the millennial side, what we've seen over the years is that families are much more attuned to values versus like the features and benefits game.
Yes.
And, that could, in my mind, could be an offset to maybe if you're not competing at the facilities level, like, is there something in there? Are you seeing any of that with your families as you're surveying, is that question of, do your values as a school align with our values as a family? Is that emerging in any of the research that you're doing?
It is, but it seems to be more of a concern with families that choose religious institutions, actually.
Sure.
That's much more of a draw, where they're looking for something that's really specific.
Really?
But with that being said, I think articulating your values clearly is an extension of your brand. And I do think that there is something about that that's very important when it comes to distinguishing your school specifically from other options in the market, regardless of what category they fall into.
Right.
There's almost this natural fit that tends to happen between a family that finds a values-aligned institution. And I do think that independent schools are better equipped to articulate that and demonstrate that than, say, a large public school district, where it's much tougher to align a bunch of different campuses under a single mission or vision or sense of values. And so that is something that is important. And I have seen that millennial parents and, Gen Z is on its way up and moving into that area, that values alignment is something that people are looking for more. It's not quite as high in importance, with making sure academic needs are being met, especially since we're seeing an increasing range of learning issues with children. We're dealing with learning loss that's ongoing because of the pandemic. So that's a really big one. And a natural byproduct of that is high caliber teachers that families are looking for. Safety is a really big thing, which is interesting. We've seen that increase in importance steadily over the last several years that we've surveyed parents, where it's one of the top things. They want to know that they are sending their children to a facility every day where they're going to come home when the bell rings at the end of the day.
Yeah. How might they lean into that, right? So, when I say that, I'm specifically saying like showcasing their values. Like, what are some things that schools could do to articulate that and tell that story?
For one, it has to be more than just putting a list of values on your website and in your hallways, right? And it's not just about the marketing materials, it's about the actual execution and embodiment of those values. And one thing that I actually learned and loved when I went through a rebranding project at my previous school was we made a change to make our values, we converted them from a list of words to action. And there's something really, really powerful in that because it takes it beyond that list of words that if you line up a bunch of independent school websites, the odds that you're going to find a lot of the same words are pretty high. But when you turn them into actionable expectations, there's power in that. And I think it also makes it easier to live those out and demonstrate that to prospective families. So one thing, I think we had one that was respect was the value, and we changed it to respect and value all equally. And that comes out in your DEI work. It comes through in how you cater to learning differences. It comes through in how you engage in the community and community service opportunities that you offer. And so that's a really helpful lens for schools to think about as they're thinking about their values. Beyond the list, what do those values actually mean? And how can you incorporate that into your culture, incorporate that into the stories that you're telling on your website and on other platforms? That's where things become really powerful. And it's not just anybody can come up with a list of words, just like anybody can come up with a tagline. But you have to really be able to show, we say show, don't tell. That's a really great example of where that becomes really important.
That's so brilliant. I love how you just framed that. I mean, because if you go on a school website now, there's just a massive opportunity for independent schools to do exactly what you just said. And some are obviously going down that path already. But, if you pick 10 independent school websites and hit them all in sequential order, then what you're probably going to find are a lot of similarities in terms of like marketing features and benefits.
Yep.
How many teachers have advanced degrees, how many AP courses offer, college lists, all those things, right? And I get it. And I think that actually plays really well into like the Gen X and baby boomer mindset, which is how we've been marketing for a long, long time.
Yeah.
But there's this big opportunity to do what you were talking about, which is like taking those values and giving them life through stories, whether it's video, written, what have you. I think that's like, that to me is the new frontier in terms of how we position our schools. I'd love to get your take on that.
I completely agree. And I do think, when you look at the sort of fast facts section, of the website that we all know very well that has the student teacher ratio and number of service hours and all of that, I think there is an opportunity to rethink that. There's actually a partner of ours where their school is very, very deeply committed to service. And so their fast facts are not just about how many acres they have and the sort of standard things, but they're very well branded. And so they talk about the number of community service hours, but also the number of organizations that they've partnered with in the community for service. And that so you can quantify things that are uniquely yours. Low student to teacher ratios, that's table stakes. Having teachers with advanced degrees, well, most public schools require that if you want to continue to move up. Right. So that's actually not a differentiator.
Right.
I mean, I hate to say it, but I see it on so many websites and in postcards that we get at my house and all of that. But that's actually not that compelling. That's pretty standard. And so it's really important to think about what it is about you that you want to quantify for those fast facts, but also to weave those values, weave your mission into the stories that you're telling.
You know how I like to think about it, Angela, is like, and this is something that I've kind of landed on over the last year or so, or 6 months, or however long. But when a family enrolls at a school, they're entering into an agreement with the school that the school is going to provide a transformational outcome for that child. Mm-hmm. And that outcome could be anything. It could be an academic one, social, emotional, athletic, artistic, what have you, combination of things, what have you. And it's real, right? In exchange for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000, 60, whatever the tuition cost is like,
Yeah.
this is what is going to happen on the other side of that. Those transformational outcomes are happening every day on campus, every day. And like being able to showcase that in ways that maybe we haven't quite figured out yet, like there's the opportunity. And when you do that, the values start to emerge as well. I love where you're taking all of this, because it just makes so much sense to me, especially in the age of like of YouTube and TikTok and all the different things. Like we're expecting like to be able to identify quickly with the people or organizations that matter most to us.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Hey, I have a question. So, there are approximately 700,000 or so students enrolled in NAIS schools, right? Then you kind of take it out. If you're looking at that as the core, and then there's probably, I think, 4 or 5 million families that are attending fee-based schools. It could be a faith-based school, what have you, right? It could be anything, Catholic school, whatever. And then there's approximately 50 million students who are going to public schools in the United States. So all told, there's about 56 million kids in K-12 in the United States. I often wonder, well, what if we could grow our population, the NAIS membership, but the students that attend these schools by 3% over 5 years? That would be approximately 21,000 new students. Like how, based on, again, given all this data that you have and the traffic flows that are coming through your site, like what would be like when I pose that question to you, like what comes to mind? Like how might you approach that problem, or in terms of solving for growth versus kind of staying flat in terms of where we are right now?
Yeah. It's tough, but I think there are two ways to think about this. One is making the case for independent schools, and the other is making the case for your school.
Yeah.
Right. And so, in my opinion, honestly, the independent school piece is almost secondary, because if we're being really honest, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, there are several attributes of independent schools that are not necessarily unique to independent schools, right? So do some independent schools have great facilities, as we talked about? Yes, but so do other types of
Right.
schools. Do
Right.
independent schools have great STEM programs, fine arts programs, internship programs? Sure, but so do some public schools and public magnet schools and charter schools,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
And so part of it is, we're making the case for the school category and the value of that category, right? Because one thing that we're really seeing in our data is increasing price sensitivity. And so that's an alarm bell that I know we've been raising for some time, but we're really starting to see more families saying that this is a deciding factor for them, more families pulling out of schools or removing them from their consideration list because they don't think that they're going to get the financial aid that they want or are hoping for. But the branding becomes really important when we're looking at specific schools. I think there's a real need still for independent schools to do that inward look and define that unique individual value and
Yeah.
clearly articulate that to prospective families.
That
Small
differentiator,
classes,
right?
beautiful grounds, that's great. It's not enough.
Right.
But the strong brand also makes sure that you're not just attracting a broader pool of students, but you're also getting the right ones, because that's important too, right? We don't just want to fill up the top of the funnel if ultimately those families are going to drop out midway, or worse, you're going to have students that join your community and they're not a fit, right? So it's a two-pronged approach, really. But I think starting with making the case for choosing this type of school, and then why us? What is it about us that's really, really valuable?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And, I've been thinking about, like, are there different ways that we can serve kids to expand our market? We've got a very defined way in which we work with students, kind of the 8 to 4 experience, or maybe, later in the day. But, are there other ways in which we can serve kids that would have mission-aligned impact that's really important to us, but also give opportunities? And it's just interesting to see some schools who are approaching that from different angles and thinking
Yeah.
about how do they broaden their reach maybe not necessarily everybody on campus the same day, but like there are other ways that you can approach it. It's just the thought that I've been thinking, I've had in my head for a while now.
I'm a big advocate for finding opportunities to open your doors to the
Yeah.
community and give them an opportunity that's not admission driven. It's not an enrollment event, but just to get a taste of what it
Yep.
is that you do.
Yeah.
And there's actually a school right in my backyard. I'm in Northern Virginia, Oakwood School. It's a school that works specifically with students that have language-based learning differences. And they have this phenomenal program where they partner with families in the community. You know, they don't expect you to come and pay tuition, but they can help you with testing. They can help you, you know, connect with people who can support your student beyond what they might be getting in a public school.
Yeah.
And I think they're actually, it may have just happened or it's happening. We're recording in mid-March, but they're doing an open house, a community open house, where people can just come and learn about those services. It's not even about the school, but learn about how the school can help you.
Yeah.
And I think that that's brilliant because
Yeah.
all it takes is one family to have an amazing experience with that, to think, maybe I want my child to have this experience 5 days a week,
Yeah.
right? And so it's those opportunities to connect with the community that are just so valuable.
Yeah, and to that end, with that program, I mean, by providing advocacy services to families to better position their child in their public school, whatever school they're in, like they're serving their mission, right? Which is important.
Absolutely.
And it's an opportunity to generate a revenue stream that didn't exist before. So like
Yep.
it's just an idea. I love that example. I've actually had a chance to talk to them about it. It's a really fascinating program that they're doing.
Mhm.
But there are others that are out there too. Like I think about Village School down of Naples and what they're doing with their college guidance program and how they're
Yeah.
serving the broader community. Like it kind of
Yeah.
has a similar way of allowing the school to function outside of its four walls. So I
Exactly.
mean, that's a whole nother case study, right? But like
Yeah.
it is fascinating that there are these opportunities that are available to us that maybe weren't there 10, 15 years ago, in part because the technology wouldn't support it. But now
Right.
we've got all these things that make scaling possible in new ways. Hey, I got a question about like emerging competition. Like, so, we've talked about, independent schools competing, beyond the independent schools down the street, but are you seeing other sectors like they're starting to emerge that we should put on schools' radar?
So I think the good news is that I'm not hugely worried about some of these emerging school categories like homeschooling, which we do know has been growing. But despite the headlines, what we're seeing is that families who are choosing homeschooling are not typically the types of families who would be evaluating or considering an independent school in the first place. And what I mean by that is it's situations where maybe it's a military family and they move so often, it's just simpler. Or it's a last resort, which happens a lot, where they already feel like they've been failed by the other options that are in front of them. From what we've seen, even though we don't have a huge population of homeschool families on the platform or families who take the survey, they tend to be more price sensitive. Even if we look at our broader, parent subscribers, the homeschool families tend to be even more price sensitive. And so that's another area where it might not even occur to them to consider an independent school because they see the price and it's inaccessible, right? And so
Yep.
these tend to be families who they feel like they've explored all the options that they have. And so this is what they think is the next best thing. Online schools, we've been hearing a lot about, especially coming out of COVID, and they're definitely a player, but again, to a much smaller degree than other types of schools. What we see is actually a lot of connection between families who are considering homeschooling and families who are looking at online schools because they're trying to decide whether or not they want to administer their own curriculum.
Yeah, makes
So
sense.
there's a lot of connection there, but still our traffic on the platform for NAS schools is 1,400% higher than it
Right.
is for online schools, right? So
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think that's the big bad wolf, but well-resourced publics, charter schools, religious private schools that have those lower sticker prices, those are still very much in the mix.
Yeah. Well, knowing that, right, if the lower price and religious, faith-based schools, public charter are the main competition. What are some things that schools should be doing to stand out, right? I think about about their digital footprint, for instance. Like, what
Yeah.
kind of advice would you offer there?
I cannot emphasize how important it is.
Yep.
Your digital footprint is really, really important. And this is actually an area where I think independent schools have an opportunity to shine, starting with your website that is known to be, that's the bread and butter of the parent search experience once they get to it. And independent schools tend to have more resources to, hire a company to come in and overhaul their website and put a lot of gloss and polish on it. Their websites are also much simpler to navigate than, a website for a large public school district. It's easier to connect with people. Even charter school networks, the sites can be a little rough. Faith-based schools tend to have lower budgets, and so they take longer intervals of time in updating their digital presence. They tend to have even leaner teams than you find in independent schools. And so that's actually an area where there's a real opportunity to stand out just inherently by virtue of the resources that you have. So investing in SEO, critically important. Having the beautiful website is great, but not so great if people can't find it. And we know that they're not necessarily going to you directly. There's a process that happens before they go to, fillintheblankschool.org, right? They're starting in Google, they're going on Niche, they're going on Private School Review, they're talking to friends, they're in Facebook groups. There's a lot that happens before they get that list of schools that they're actually going to start looking at websites for. So making sure that that early process is really buttoned up is important.
It's funny. We started this as kind of a broader conversation around competition, and now we're really narrowing it down to differentiation.
Mhm.
Like how do you stand out in a crowded field? If a school were to call you and say, I'm just trying to figure out where do I start in terms of differentiating? What would be some initial steps that you would offer? What advice would you give?
I would start by asking a lot of questions. And I think that's if you were to go through let's say you hire a company to do brand work for you.
Yeah.
That's where they're going to start. They're going to start by asking you a lot of questions about your institution. What are your values? What have you heard? What are you known for? Because it's helpful to know what the market thinks, whether or not you agree. And most people, especially if you're in admissions or marketing, you have a sense of what that is.
Yeah.
Is there truth to that? What do you want to be known for? What do you think your school does very well? The hard thing is typically when you ask someone what they think their school does very well, you hear something that doesn't distinguish them from anyone else at all.
Sure.
And so that's where it becomes really important. It's almost a teachable moment where typically when you want to get to that list of bullets about what makes you unique, you have to ask people, you have to ask your own people, and you have to ask people who don't sit in admissions, they don't sit in marketing, people who don't sit around the leadership table. You have to actually gather that data to understand what your families think. It's incredible how often I've seen situations where what families believe to be a school's value proposition can be different from what people in leadership think, and that's problematic. If there's a huge gap in the market between what people in line at your local grocery store think your school stands for and what you want to stand for, because there's a difference. You might think you stand for something, but if people outside of your buildings don't know that, there's an issue, right?
Yep.
So I would start by asking a lot of questions, and the guidance that I would provide is do a really simple internal survey to start to tease that information out. If you can't afford to hire a company to do a bunch of market research and to do a full brand overhaul for you, at least start by asking your families. You can also tease some things out from your parent surveys if you're in the habit of doing those annually, which you should be. You can find the themes and
Yep.
see, okay, these are the things we do well, and really take a deep dive into that and start to uncover what your brand actually is. And that's really important. If you're a school that believes that you serve students with learning differences really well, but then you look into the data and find out that that isn't the case, well, then maybe you need to take another look at that.
Yeah.
right? But you don't know if you don't ask, and you can't ask the people who are sitting around the table making the decisions. You're just you got to get to the people who are living the experience every
Yeah.
day, good and bad, good and
Good
bad.
and bad. Angela Brown, thank you so much for taking time and just having this broad conversation around competition versus differentiation. They're so linked. If somebody wants to follow up with you and get a hold of you, like what's the best way for them to where can they find you? I guess is the question.
I will take email, angela.brown@niche.com. And if for folks who know me, including Peter, I love LinkedIn. So definitely find me there. I am always up for making new connections, happy to grab virtual coffee, in-person coffee if you're in the DC area, and happy to talk shop at any time.
Great. Angela, thanks so much.
Thank you.